At 2:34 this morning Eastern Time, inside a secure conference room at NATO headquarters in Brussels, something happened that has never occurred in the 77-year history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The permanent representatives of 28 European member states convened an emergency session without American participation to discuss what multiple sources familiar with the discussions are calling the most serious transatlantic crisis since the Suez Canal dispute of 1956. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you because what began 72 hours ago as a bizarre territorial dispute over Greenland has now escalated into a full-scale diplomatic rupture that could fundamentally reshape the Western alliance and trigger a trade war that economists are warning could push the global economy into recession. If you care about what happens to American credibility on the world stage over the next week, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the events unfolding at this very moment will determine whether the United States remains the leader of the free world or whether we are witnessing the final collapse of an international order that has kept the peace for nearly 8 decades. Here's what we know. According to 3 independent sources, 2 from European diplomatic missions and 1 from a senior advisor inside the State Department, President Trump issued an ultimatum to the governments of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany at approximately 11:47 p.m. last night. The message, delivered through official diplomatic channels, but written in language that multiple recipients described as unprecedented in its hostility, declared that unless these 3 nations publicly support American territorial claims to Greenland within 96 hours, the United States will impose immediate 10% tariffs on all goods imported from these countries. The tariffs would affect approximately $580 billion in annual trade. To put that in perspective, that represents more trade volume than the entire GDP of Poland. 3 constitutional scholars, 2 liberal and 1 conservative, all agree that what Trump is attempting here violates at minimum 4 different international treaties that the United States has signed and ratified over the past 75 years. Multiple people briefed on the European response tell us that the reaction in London, Paris, and Berlin was not just shock, but what one German official described as visceral disgust at the crudeness of the threat. Within 6 hours of receiving Trump's ultimatum, the foreign ministers of all 3 nations had conference calls with their counterparts across the European Union. By 8 a.m. Brussels time this morning, the emergency NATO session had been called. And here is the detail that should concern every American who understands what alliances actually mean. According to sources inside that NATO meeting, the European representatives spent 2 hours discussing not whether to comply with Trump's demand, but whether the time has come to fundamentally reconsider Europe's security relationship with the United States. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the timeline matters enormously, and what you are about to see is a masterclass in diplomatic self-destruction. This did not happen overnight. This was a cascade of insults, territorial obsessions, and strategic miscalculations, and every single step has been documented by officials who are now speaking out because they believe the American people deserve to know what is being done in their name. If you are finding this analysis valuable, hit that like button right now, because this story is about to get significantly more complicated and the mainstream media will not connect these dots for you. Tuesday, February 18th, 10 a.m. Trump holds what was supposed to be a routine cabinet meeting at the White House. According to 2 officials present in the room, the president spends 47 minutes of the 90-minute meeting obsessing over a map of the Arctic that his national security advisor had brought to brief him on Russian military activity near Alaska. But Trump is not interested in Russia. He keeps pointing to Greenland, the massive ice-covered island that is an autonomous territory of Denmark with a population of 56,000 people. Trump tells the room, and I am quoting directly from notes taken by one participant, that Greenland represents the greatest strategic asset America has failed to acquire since we bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. He says the island contains rare earth minerals worth an estimated $1.5 trillion. He says China is trying to establish economic control through mining investments and that Denmark, a NATO ally with a population smaller than the state of Wisconsin, lacks the capability to defend or develop the territory properly. What most people do not know is that this is not the first time Trump has become fixated on Greenland. During his first term in 2019, he publicly proposed purchasing the island from Denmark. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, called the idea absurd and stated in no uncertain terms that Greenland is not for sale and never will be. Trump cancelled a scheduled state visit to Denmark in retaliation, describing the Prime Minister's response as nasty and inappropriate, even though she was simply stating the legal and political reality that Greenland, while part of the Kingdom of Denmark, has home rule and its own government that would have to consent to any sovereignty transfer, which they have made abundantly clear they would never do. The matter seemed to fade from public discussion as Trump moved on to other controversies. But according to sources who have worked with Trump across both his first administration and his current second term, the Greenland obsession never went away. It became what one former advisor called a psychological fixation, a symbol of a deal that got away, a transaction he was told he could not make. And for a man whose entire identity is built on the idea that he can close any deal, that rejection festered like an open wound. Multiple former White House officials have confirmed that Trump would bring up Greenland in meetings that had nothing to do with Arctic policy. He would point to maps and talk about how stupid Denmark was for not recognizing the opportunity he was offering them. He would fantasize about the resources beneath the ice and how America was letting China gain a foothold through economic investments while we sat back and did nothing. One source who attended national security briefings told us that Trump once asked his lawyers to research whether the United States could simply claim Greenland based on some interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine or historical precedent, and when his legal team explained that no such justification existed under international law, Trump reportedly said, "Then we need new international law." Wednesday, February 19th, the insult heard around the world. Trump gives an interview to a conservative podcast where he describes the leaders of America's European allies as weak, socialist, and freeloaders who have been exploiting American military protection for decades without paying their fair share. But here is where it gets personal and dangerous. He singles out the prime ministers of the UK, France, and Germany by name. He calls British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer a third-rate bureaucrat who could not negotiate his way out of a parking ticket. He describes French President Emmanuel Macron as a Napoleon wannabe whose military could not win a war against the Swiss. And he says German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is so terrified of his own Green Party that he has turned Germany into an economic disaster that makes East Germany look competent. These are not off-the-cuff remarks. These are calculated insults delivered on camera and then amplified by Trump's social media accounts to an audience of 95 million followers. The reaction in Europe is swift and unified in a way that veteran diplomats describe as unprecedented. Within hours, all three governments issue statements expressing profound disappointment at language unbefitting a head of state and ally. But these are not the usual carefully calibrated diplomatic statements that use euphemisms and indirect language. These are blunt, direct condemnations that signal something fundamental has broken in the relationship. The German Foreign Ministry issues a press release noting that Germany contributes more than 2% of GDP to defense spending, exceeding NATO requirements, and that German soldiers serve alongside American forces in multiple theaters, including Iraq and the Baltic states. The statement goes further, noting that Germany lost 59 soldiers in Afghanistan fighting a war triggered by an attack on American soil, and that these insults dishonor their sacrifice and service. The French government reminds the United States that France is the only European nation with nuclear weapons and permanent UN Security Council status, and has been America's ally since the Revolutionary War when French military and financial support was essential to American independence. The statement includes a pointed reminder that French forces have conducted operations against terrorism in the Sahel region of Africa that directly protect European and American interests while receiving little support or recognition from Washington. The British Foreign Secretary issues what diplomatic observers describe as an unusually blunt statement saying that personal attacks on democratically elected leaders damage the special relationship and serve no constructive purpose, and noting that the United Kingdom contributes significantly to global security through intelligence sharing, military cooperation, and diplomatic coordination that benefits the entire democratic world. Now here is what concerns me most and what mainstream media is not telling you because they are focused on the surface drama rather than the structural breakdown underneath. These public statements represent the diplomatic equivalent of setting your hair on fire and jumping into the ocean. Governments do not issue statements like this unless the private channels have completely broken down and there is no other mechanism for communicating displeasure. According to sources familiar with the back-channel communications that typically handle sensitive disputes between allies, all three European governments attempted to address Trump's insults through private diplomatic outreach before going public. The UK ambassador to the United States requested an urgent meeting with the Secretary of State to discuss the president's comments and was told the secretary's schedule was full for the foreseeable future. The request was denied. The French diplomatic mission sent 3 separate cables through classified channels attempting to de-escalate the situation and request clarification about whether the president's comments represented official US policy or personal opinion. All 3 cables went unanswered for 72 hours. Germany's foreign minister placed a direct call to her American counterpart seeking a private conversation to address the situation before it escalated further. The call was not returned for 48 hours, and when it finally was returned, the American response was reportedly a brief conversation where the secretary suggested that if European leaders do not want to be criticized, they should stop criticizing American policy. What you are seeing in those public statements is not diplomatic theater designed for domestic political consumption. It is genuine alarm that the normal mechanisms for managing alliance relationships, the private channels that allow allies to air grievances and resolve disputes without public confrontation, have ceased to function. When those channels break down, public statements become the only remaining tool, and public statements create their own escalation dynamics, because once positions are stated publicly, backing down becomes politically costly for all parties involved. Thursday, February 20th, Trump doubles down. At a rally in Ohio, he tells a crowd of 12,000 supporters that he is not going to apologize for telling the truth about European weakness. He says that if Europe does not like American leadership, they are welcome to defend themselves without American troops, American intelligence, and American nuclear umbrella. He says Denmark has 72 hours to begin negotiations to transfer Greenland to American sovereignty, or he will consider imposing tariffs on Danish goods. Then comes the expansion that changed everything. He says, and I want you to hear this exactly as he said it, Britain, France, and Germany think they can criticize me and face no consequences. They think they can freeload off American power forever. Well, I have news for them. If they want to act like enemies of American interests, they will be treated like enemies of American interests. Support our claim to Greenland or face the economic consequences. Your choice. The crowd in Ohio erupts in applause. Trump supporters see this as strength, as America finally standing up to allies who take advantage. But in the capitals of Europe, the response is something American officials are privately describing as panic mixed with rage. And here is why. Trump has just made a public ultimatum that gives America's closest allies 3 options, all of them catastrophic for transatlantic relations. Option 1. They can submit to the ultimatum, publicly endorse a territorial claim that violates international law, humiliate themselves before their own populations, and establish the precedent that America can simply demand support for any action, no matter how legally dubious. Option 2. They can refuse and face punishing tariffs that would devastate industries from automobiles to pharmaceuticals to aerospace, triggering recession across Europe and likely retaliation that would harm American exporters. Option 3. They can call Trump's bluff, refuse to comply, and dare him to follow through, risking a complete breakdown of the Western alliance at precisely the moment when China and Russia are watching for any sign of fracture they can exploit. Before we get to what happened next, I need to tell you about the four leaders whose decisions over the next 96 hours will determine whether the transatlantic alliance survives this crisis or collapses into the worst diplomatic rupture since World War II. These are not abstractions. These are human beings facing impossible choices with consequences that will define their legacies and potentially reshape the global order. Start with Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, who took office just 9 months ago after Labour's landslide victory ended 14 years of Conservative rule. Starmer is a former human rights lawyer who prosecuted war crimes at The Hague before entering politics. He built his reputation on principle, on the rule of law, on the idea that international norms matter. His entire political identity is wrapped up in the concept of a rules-based international order. And now he is being told by the President of the United States to endorse a territorial grab that violates the UN Charter, the law of the sea, and every principle of sovereignty that has governed international relations since 1945. According to two people who have spoken with Starmer in the past 48 hours, he views Trump's ultimatum as not merely offensive, but as an existential test of whether Britain will subordinate its values to economic blackmail. One senior Labour MP told us that Starmer said in a private meeting yesterday, "If we comply, we are not a sovereign nation. We are a client state." Those were his words. This is not mere rhetoric. This is a Prime Minister concluding that his choice is between Britain's dignity and Britain's economy, and he is leaning toward dignity even if it means pain. Emmanuel Macron presents an entirely different psychological profile. The French president is ambitious, vain, intellectually arrogant, and deeply invested in the idea of France as a counterweight to American unilateralism. Macron has spent years positioning himself as the leader of European strategic autonomy, the vision that Europe must develop its own military capability and reduce dependence on American security guarantees. Trump's ultimatum is both an insult and an opportunity. It is an insult because Macron views himself as Trump's intellectual superior and resents being lectured by someone he privately describes, according to sources familiar with his comments, as a real estate developer with no understanding of history or strategy. But it is also an opportunity because Trump's threats validate everything Macron has been arguing. If Macron can rally Europe to unified resistance, he positions himself as the statesman who stood up to American bullying and accelerated European independence. Multiple sources tell us that Macron sees this crisis as his Churchill moment, the leadership test that will define his presidency. The question is whether his ambition will lead him to escalate when de-escalation might still be possible. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, is perhaps in the most precarious position of all. Germany is Europe's largest economy and its de facto leader, but Scholz leads a fragile coalition government that is already underwater in the polls and faces growing pressure from right-wing populists who want Germany to distance itself from both Brussels and Washington. Scholz's political survival depends on maintaining economic stability. Germany's export-driven economy cannot afford a trade war with the United States. But Scholz also cannot be seen as capitulating to American threats without triggering a government crisis that could bring down his coalition and potentially put far-right nationalists into power. According to sources inside the German Chancellery, Scholz is attempting to navigate between these impossible pressures by seeking a face-saving compromise, a joint statement with the US that avoids explicit endorsement of territorial claims while affirming general cooperation on Arctic security. But Trump has shown zero interest in compromise language. He wants explicit public support or nothing, and time is running out. And then there is the player almost nobody is talking about, but who may hold the key to everything, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. Greenland is Danish territory. Denmark is a NATO ally. And Denmark is watching the United States attempt to coerce its closest friends into supporting a territorial claim against Danish sovereignty. Multiple sources tell us that Denmark has quietly reached out to the European Union invoking Article 42. 7 of the Treaty on European Union, the Mutual Defence Clause that has been used only once before, after the 2015 Paris terrorist attacks. If the EU Council votes to invoke mutual defence obligations, it would transform this from a bilateral dispute into a collective security issue where an attack on Denmark, even an economic attack, becomes an attack on all 27 EU member states. This is where it gets dangerous, because if Europe unifies behind Denmark and Trump follows through on tariffs, you are not looking at a spat with 3 countries. You are looking at economic warfare with the entire European Union, an economy larger than the United States, representing America's largest trading partner and the foundation of the liberal international order. Which brings us to last night at 11:47 p.m., when everything finally broke. The ultimatum was delivered simultaneously through official State Department cables to the embassies of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany in Washington. According to someone who has seen the text, and I have been briefed on multiple sections, though not the complete document, the message runs 4 pages. The first page recites Trump's grievances, European failure to meet NATO spending commitments, criticism of American leadership, resistance to American strategic priorities. The second page articulates the demand. Within 96 hours, the governments of the UK, France, and Germany must issue public statements supporting American sovereignty claims to Greenland and endorsing negotiations for territorial transfer. The third page details the consequences of non-compliance, 10% tariffs on all goods, potential restrictions on technology transfers, reconsideration of intelligence sharing agreements. The fourth page, and this is the part that sources describe as genuinely shocking, suggests that European compliance would be rewarded not just with avoiding tariffs, but with preferential trade terms, increased access to American LNG exports to reduce dependence on Russian energy, and expanded military cooperation. It is carrot and stick, but the stick is a baseball bat and the carrot is rotten. The European response was immediate and coordinated in ways that demonstrate just how seriously they are taking this crisis. At 2:34 a.m. Brussels time, the emergency NATO session convened with permanent representatives from all 28 European member states present either in person or via secure video conference. Here is what isn't public and what multiple sources have confirmed to us through direct knowledge of the discussions. The meeting was not called to discuss compliance with Trump's ultimatum. It was not called to debate the merits of Greenland sovereignty or to find a compromise position. It was called to discuss whether the ultimatum itself constitutes a violation of Article 5, the collective defense provision that states an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. The European representatives argued, according to detailed notes taken by participants, that economic coercion specifically designed to force support for territorial claims against another NATO member, Denmark, constitutes an attack on the alliance itself that threatens the foundational principle of sovereignty and mutual defense. This is unprecedented legal and diplomatic territory because Article 5 has only been invoked once in NATO's history, after the September 11th attacks, and it was designed to address military aggression, not economic threats from a fellow member state. The American representative, who was allowed to attend only for the first 30 minutes before being asked to leave so Europeans could deliberate privately without American presence influencing the discussion, reportedly attempted to characterize the tariff threat as routine trade negotiation unrelated to NATO security matters and therefore outside the scope of alliance concerns. According to someone briefed on the exchange, the French representative responded with barely controlled anger, Do not insult our intelligence. This is extortion dressed up as diplomacy, and every person in this room knows it. You are threatening 3 NATO members with economic destruction unless they publicly support territorial claims against a 4th NATO member. If that is not an attack on the alliance, then the alliance has no meaning. The American representative attempted to push back, suggesting that Trump's comments were being taken out of context and that no formal policy decision H.